Hi, Evan.
Hi, Bob. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for being here. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You're Evan Thompson, professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia. This is my second conversation with you on this platform. We discussed a really fascinating book you wrote called Waking, Dreaming, Being some time ago. People can find that by Googling it. You're also the co-author of a well-known book called The Embodied Mind, along with Francisco Varela and Eleanor Roche, and that may come up in the course of this conversation. Now, the which is going to be about your new book, Why I Am Not a Buddhist. That's what it looks like. Published by Yale University Press. Very interesting book. Interesting to me, for one thing, because you spend a certain amount of it critiquing, and it's fair to say criticizing, I think, my book, Why Buddhism is True. So I took a special interest in it. I'm going to work at being not too self-indulgent in the course of this conversation, and I'm going to try not to spend the entire conversation on like petty grievances about whether you characterize me accurately or whether your criticisms are valid. Can't guarantee it. I did meditate this morning, but as you know, that's no guarantee of anything. So what I do want to do is I want to let the argument you're making in your book unfold more or less organically and focus on that. And then when a part of your argument is relevant to something you say about my book, I may, interject that, address that issue, but otherwise, try to get through your argument. And then at the end of that, when we've given that, pretty thorough, assessment, if I have big issues left over that I want to address in terms of things you said about my book, then maybe if we have time, I'll do that. In any event, I think, my promotional instincts tell me I should encourage people who enjoy disagreement to stay tuned, because even if we don't get to that right away, we will eventually. Now, I think before we get into your argument, maybe we should get into your biography a little bit. You do that in the book because it's actually kind of relevant to your attitude toward what you're calling, or what has been called, Buddhist modernism, I guess, and which is to say, Buddhism as conceived by a number of people, mainly in the West, you might say, a relatively, more secular version of Buddhism and so on. We'll get into what you mean, but first let's talk about your past, because first of all, it's very interesting. I wasn't raised on a commune. You were. And secondly, you encountered Buddhism much earlier than I did. In your case, I think age 11. And also, you had reason to be ambivalent about it from the beginning, kind of. You had mixed attitudes towards. So why don't you tell us your, just briefly your life story as it pertains to the book?
All right. Okay. Great. So I guess the place to start is when I was around 11 years old. My parents, my father William Irwin Thompson and my mother Gail Thompson, founded an alternative educational and spiritual, you could say, institute that also was run as an intentional community. So this is in the early 1970s. It was called the Lindisfarne Association. And it was originally it was based in Southampton, Long Island, and New York, and then also in Manhattan. And the idea that my father really had when he started it was, so he was a university professor at York University in Toronto. He was a full professor with tenure. And he felt in the early 1970s that the universities weren't really providing the kind of education that he thought was needed for the culture at the time. In a whole different range of ways. But I suppose you could say in relationship to what at the time was perceived as a kind of cultural crisis of meaning, very much some of the same things that we're, facing today, environmental issues, political issues. This was in the, context of some years ago, of course, but very much the same kinds of issues still with us. At any rate, so he left the university as a full professor, walked out on the university, wrote an article called Walking Out on the University, and founded the Lindisfarne Association. And what the Institute did is it brought together scientists and scholars and environmentalists and activists and religious spiritual teachers from a whole bunch of different religions or faiths, including Buddhist teachers. And these lived with us in a, commune residential community setting. And then there were yearly conferences that would bring together people from elsewhere internationally. And so from a very early age, I was raised around Buddhism and Buddhist teachers. My first exposure really to Buddhism, aside from reading about it in books, was through Zen Buddhist teachers who lived with us. We had close ties to the San Francisco Zen Center. My father was a very good friend of Richard Baker Roshi, who was the abbot of the San Francisco Zen Center at that time. And so he was a Lindisfarne fellow, and he sent teachers, monks, to live with us and instruct the community in Zen meditation. And my first ambivalence to Buddhism was really that exposure. So we had gone away, my family, my father and my mother and my sister and I, we had gone to England and Scotland for a couple weeks. This was like 1974. And then we came back to the community, and the Zen monks had sort of set up residence while we were gone, and they had instructed people in meditation. And from the perspective of the kids, the commune had been sort of taken over by a Zen demeanor, let's call it. That is the meditation room, which was supposed to be a kind of ecumenical space for people to practice any form of meditation, had been sort of regimented in a Zen way with Zen ritual, and Zen posture.
Isn't Zen a little bigger on regimentation than some other Buddhist traditions, or is that just a stereotype? It is. Yeah,
no, I think that's fair to say. I think definitely Japanese Zen, especially as it was brought to North America, there's a lot of emphasis on ritual, on posture. That has a deeper philosophical basis too, in the sense that in some ways of thinking about meditation in the Zen or in Chinese Chan tradition, the idea is that the ritual, the posture, the sitting is the meditation, and the idea that you should be trying to kind of get somewhere else is constantly sort of thwarted and circumvented. Mm-hmm. Okay. And the ritual, you could say, reminds people of that. But from an outsider's perspective, coming back to it, especially from the perspective of a kid who was kind of used to like running around and making noise and, doing whatever we wanted. It was the 1970s after all, so kids were given a fair amount of free reign. All of a sudden we had
especially on communes. My father was an army officer, so that attitude wasn't universal in the 70s, but
right. Yeah, no, definitely in a commune setting for sure. So my reaction to it was that my perception of it was that it seemed forced and artificial, and you could say that it was from a kid's perspective, it was not sort of genuine and warm and humane. It was very sort of strict and cold. Mm-hmm. A kid's perspective on a commune, not a kid's perspective growing up on a military base, of course. So that was my first exposure to it. But I had ambivalences in the sense that I was always very interested in Buddhism, especially philosophically, even from an early age. My dad had given me, books about Buddhism that were kind of written for teenagers. Mm-hmm. I should say, by way of background, my father was raised as an Irish Catholic, very, very severe, heavy dose of Irish Catholicism. He was sent away to Irish Catholic military boarding school when he was like 7 years old, and left the church when he was 13. So this would have been in the 1950s, and searched for other, religious spiritual paths. And eventually he personally hit on yoga in the tradition of Yogananda, which was popular in California at the time. But he always had a very kind of ecumenical attitude towards religion. So as a result, we had a lot of different, religious spiritual teachers, Christian, Christian priests, Buddhist, Jewish teachers. And so that was part of the milieu that I grew up in. And I was saying to a friend the other day, just to kind of give the kids' perspective again, the kids kind of judge the teachers in terms of how nice they were to the kids. And the Zen teachers, I have to say, were kind of at the bottom. They weren't so nice. And the Sufi teachers were really nice. They were always really attentive to the kids. So that's kind of how the kids perceive things in this weird setting. So that was the first exposure. And then through Lindisfarne, I met the Buddhist writer and translator Bob Thurman.
And then you studied under him at Amherst College, right, as an undergraduate?
Then I studied under him at Amherst College. So because I had met him through my dad at Lindisfarne, I decided to apply to Amherst to study with him. I was interested in, Asian religions. I was actually really interested in Chinese history and language. So I went to Amherst, studied with him, and then did, Buddhist studies academically as an undergraduate with him, which was really, he was a fantastic teacher. And then went on in grad school in philosophy, not in religion or Asian studies, but kept the interest in Buddhism all along the way, both personally in terms of trying to relate to Buddhism as a living tradition through, say, meditation practice, and also academically, intellectually through Buddhist philosophy. And and that's continued up until this book that I wrote. Right.
And you stayed enough, I guess, a part of some Buddhist community such that you wound up being involved in this whole kind of mind and life thing. There's this Mind and Life Institute with the Mind and Life dialogues, which are probably better known to people as the Dalai Lama sitting down with scientists, and right. And this whole kind of very consciously cultivated dialogue between Buddhism and science that is prominently associated with the Dalai Lama. And this moves us a little closer to what you're going to ultimately criticize about modern Buddhism. And so why don't you talk a little about your experiences there? I know you describe an experience at the Insight Meditation Society, where I've done most of the meditation retreats I've done. It's one of the kind of foundational institutions, I would say, for American Buddhism, especially in the Theravada kind of Vipassana mindfulness tradition. And so why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, so let me just say something first about the Mind and Life Institute. The Mind and Life Institute was founded by, or the founding scientist of the Mind and Life Institute was Francisco Varela, whom you mentioned earlier, one of the co-authors of the book I did called The Embodied Mind.
Whom you had met as a child, right?
Exactly. So I met Varela at Lindisfarne as a child. He came to a conference organized by my father at Lindisfarne, and then lived with us as scholar in residence. And he was a neuroscientist, very pioneering neuroscientist. He was also a student of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who founded the Naropa Institute, now Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado. And a few years later, so this was in the 1970s, but then later towards the end of the 1980s, Varela met the Dalai Lama, and out of his meeting the Dalai Lama and the conversations they started to have about Buddhism and science, particularly Buddhism and, let's say, the mind sciences or the cognitive sciences, the Mind and Life Institute was formed. And it was formed originally as a way to facilitate and host dialogues between the Dalai Lama and scientists. Then, when Varela died in 2001, this coincided with the Mind and Life Institute kind of going public and holding public meetings about Buddhism and science with the Dalai Lama. The first one was at MIT in 2003, and that's around the time I got involved with the Mind and Life Institute, sort of in its going public phase after Varela had died. And it's really through my experience of looking at the Buddhism science dialogue as it evolved, let's say from 2003 up to like 2014-15, in the setting of the Mind and Life Institute. That was kind of the more immediate impetus for the book Why I'm Not a Buddhist. And so the Insight Meditation Society enters into that story because it would have been in 2008. Well, I should say actually before that Sharon Salzberg, who's one of the main teachers at IMS, she was also one of the principal meditation teachers at the Mind and Life Summer Research Institute, which is a yearly institute / kind of retreat setting for scientists who are interested in the study of meditation practices. And I had a hand in helping design that institute, and I was the academic chair on a number of years for the institute. It's a week-long institute that happens in Garrison, New York, and at the Garrison Institute.
Yeah, I've done a retreat there too. That's nice. Yeah.
Right. So, so through that connection between the Mind and Life Institute and teachers at IMS like Sharon Salzberg and Joseph Goldstein, in 2008, there was a special Vipassana meditation retreat. Their sort of introductory, 7-day format Vipassana retreat that was specifically designed for clinicians and scientists with an interest in meditation, like clinical psychologists and neuroscientists and so on. And I participated in that retreat. I hadn't done a Vipassana retreat before or hadn't done that style of practice before. So that was really my introduction to it in a retreat format. And so there were, grad students and postdocs from a whole bunch of different people's labs there, and scientists and, philosophers. And it was a very interesting experience that informed how I think about the Buddhism science dialogue, in the sense that what was said to be happening sort of explicitly, rhetorically, on the part of the teachers of the retreat was learning to see the mind as it is in itself, learning to sort of drop concepts, drop preconceptions, drop habitual reactions, be with the mind as it actually is from moment to moment. That was the rhetoric. And at the same time, and I should say, I was, very much caught up in that rhetoric. I found the meditation retreat, in my own case, it was actually personally kind of very exhilarating, very captivating in a way. But at the same time, the sort of skeptical philosopher side of my personality, couldn't help but notice that we were being given a conceptual system that we were encouraged to use to shape our experience and to look at everything that happened in terms of it. And that, in a way, contradicted the rhetoric of dropping concepts to see things how they are. And so that got me thinking about, well, what exactly is happening in meditation in general, and then specifically in this particular Vipassana, coming from Mahasi Sayadaw in Burma and brought into North America in the context of the 20th and 21st century. So that's part of the story of the book as well. The Why I'm Not a Buddhist. Okay,
so and a lot of the doubts that motivate the book are about common conceptions of the proper relationship between science and Buddhism. I guess it's fair to say. And so to get back to this thing you criticize called Buddhist modernism. You say, so that you're saying the dominant strand of modern Buddhism, and here I think you mean kind of in North America and, maybe in Europe, known as Buddhist modernism, or you say known as Buddhist modernism, is full of confused ideas. They coalesce around what I call Buddhist exceptionalism. Then you say, well, why don't you tell us what Buddhist exceptionalism is?
Right. So Buddhist exceptionalism is the idea that Buddhism either isn't really a religion, it's a philosophy or a way of life or a mind science, or it's a religion that's superior to other religions because it's inherently rational and empirical in a way that, say, theistic religions that posit a God or faith in God aren't. So this idea is a major strand of what historians call Buddhist modernism. And so I need to say something about what Buddhist modernism is. Buddhist modernism is the form of Buddhism that originally we see emerging in Asian countries let's say in the 19th century and then into the 20th century, that are under colonial European rule. So countries like Sri Lanka or Ceylon then and Burma or Myanmar, these countries are occupied and controlled by the British or by other European colonial influences, powers. And the European colonizers, of course, assert the superiority of the Christian religion and of European civilization and of science. and they present, Christianity as the religion that is allied with modern science. And so what the Asian reformer Buddhists do is very, very clever move, is they turn the argument around and they say, well, no, actually Buddhism is really the scientific religion because we don't believe in God, we don't believe in a creator God, we don't believe in an immortal soul, we believe everything is related causally in terms of cause and effect. And so they kind of turn the argument around and they present Buddhism as the superior and truly modern religion. And then this form of Buddhism gets exported to the West and is the kind of Buddhism that Westerners encounter. And it's very much shaped by European Protestant sensibilities, and then gets imported back into Asia. And then so there's this kind of complex, back and forth, so that it becomes a sort of transnational kind of lingua franca for modern Buddhism. This idea that Buddhism isn't really a religion, it's a kind of rational empirical philosophy or way of life, or it's a superior religion. So my book is mainly a critique of that idea of Buddhist modernism and Buddhist exceptionalism. Okay. And I should say that part of the critique is specific to it, and then part of the critique is to use it to make more general points about the relationship between science and religion. So that's kind of the larger thing in my sights.
Okay. And it is interesting, and not a lot of people appreciate this, I think, how much of what we might think of as Western Buddhism actually does begin in Asia under the circumstances you describe, including the idea of a lot of lay people meditating, which isn't the rule in Asia, but you did see that under colonial rule as a kind of, almost nationalist reaction against colonial, or traditionalist, an indigenous traditionalist reaction against colonialism.
Right, exactly.
So this is the first place where I get self-indulgent. I just want to get clear on the extent to which you think I belong to the Buddhist modernist school, because as you describe it, I don't think I do, but you say some things that seem to indicate that you think I do. So when I see you write that Buddhist exceptionalism is the belief that either Buddhism is superior to other religions in being inherently rational or empirical, or that it's not a religion but a kind of mind science, I don't identify with either of those positions so far, and there's a place where you describe my views, and I just want to be clear on what I meant when I said the things you quote here. So this is a quote from your book. When I say quote unquote, you're quoting my book, okay? But this whole thing is a quote from your book. Robert Wright argues that science corroborates the, quote, core ideas, unquote, of Buddhism. These ideas are not, quote, the supernatural or more exotically metaphysical parts of Buddhism, reincarnation, for example, but rather the naturalistic parts, ideas that fall squarely within modern psychology and philosophy. End of quote of my book and end of your quoting me. So I think most people would read that and think that I'm saying that, from that description, that the truly core ideas of Buddhism are not the supernatural ones, right? Is that, that's what you meant to have me saying?
Yeah, so I understood you to be saying there, and definitely correct me if this is mistaken, but I read you as saying that there are that Buddhism has certain core ideas, and that these ideas can be rendered in a naturalistic way, or are, let's say, compatible with a naturalistic viewpoint. And we can kind of take those from Buddhism, still call it Buddhism, while leaving out the other stuff that we're going to identify as, let's say, supernaturalist. That's how I understood you.
Yeah. Well, it's closely related to what
I would say just to sorry to interrupt, but I would say that's a Buddhist modernist move.
Yeah. That would be. I understand it, that would be, but here's so what I actually say is there's a thing called a note to readers at the very beginning of my book, right before the first chapter. And I say, look, basically any book with a title like Why Buddhism is True, it's bound to have some careful qualification somewhere along the way. Here's my qualifying. And I say, first,
Right.
I'm not talking about the quote supernatural or more exotically metaphysical parts of Buddhism, reincarnation, for example, but rather about the naturalistic parts. Okay, I elaborate on that, and then I say too, and these are numbered paragraphs. And then there's I just right away rule out the what you might call what I would call the traditionally religious parts, like rebirth, divinities, praying to divinities. I just established I'm not talking about that. Then I realize I have a second problem, which is, of course, even within the realm of naturalistic Buddhism, there are differences in different traditions in the way they interpret something like, say, the not-self doctrine, emptiness, these more philosophical or psychological ideas. So I say, I'm of course aware that there's no one Buddhism, but rather various Buddhist traditions which differ on all kinds of traditions. But this book focuses on a kind of common core fundamental ideas that are found across Buddhist tradition. So what I mean to be doing there is saying I'm only talking about the naturalistic part, and within that, I'm focusing on ideas that are pretty much common to all Buddhist traditions. I don't mean to be saying that all core ideas of Buddhism fall within the naturalistic part. And I'm in the appendix where I kind of regurgitate the whole book, summarize the whole book. I'm maybe a little more explicit. I say that, this book is about an argument for the validity of what I consider the core ideas of Buddhism. And then I say, or at least the core ideas of the, quote, naturalistic side of Buddhism. So that's what I mean the book to be about. And, to put another place where this comes through early on, and again, sorry about the self-indulgence, but, in the first chapter, page 2, I say, two of the most common Western conceptions of Buddhism, that it's atheistic and that it revolves around meditation, are wrong. Most Asian Buddhists do believe in gods, though not an omnipotent creator God, and don't meditate. So, I mean, this is the funny thing. I actually share some of the frustrations that you have about common attitudes toward Buddhism, which is like pretending that real Buddhism in Asia is this purely naturalistic thing, or for that matter, I don't agree with the other move that you identify with Buddhist exceptionalism, that it's, well, I wouldn't describe it as a kind of a mind science, I guess I would say. Right. But anyway, I want to emphasize the ideas like rebirth, which I don't address, are absolutely core ideas of Buddhism in Asia. Now, at the same time, it's possible to talk about a part of Buddhism, an offshoot of Buddhism that is now practiced by people who call themselves Buddhists, although I don't call myself a Buddhist, as I explained in the book. So I just want to be clear that the things I don't identify as a Buddhist exceptionalist myself, and to the extent that that's a prerequisite for being a Buddhist modernist, I don't consider myself one of those. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, I mean, so there's a number of things I would say in response to that. So, first of all, I would say, Buddhist modernism is not it's not as if there is one kind of thing, one doctrine, or one worked out systematic philosophy that is Buddhist modernism. Buddhist modernism is kind of constellation of different ideas. It takes different forms depending on whether it's sort of, Burmese Vipassana Buddhist modernism or whether it's Japanese Zen Buddhist modernism. So there's going to be variations. And, so that's just kind of a general point. With regard specifically to the things that you say, and I think I do mention this in my book, so for example, I say that you say that secular Buddhism actually does count as religious in a way that secular Buddhists often themselves would deny. And I agree with you on that. I think that's right. So there are specific points you make about different sort of things that we see in Buddhist modernism that I think are right and that I agree with.
I should add that's a little bit of I mean, I feel I'm kind of straining there. I'm just saying there are definitions of religion, such as William James's, which would accommodate this secular Buddhism as religious. I personally think it's a question of how you define religion, but what I'm not doing, what annoys us both, I think, is people who say, why can't, the Asians got it right. They have a religion that has no gods and and that's just not true. We agree on that. Right.
Right. So what I would say, I mean, to come more to the substance of the issue, what I would say is that it is a Buddhist modernist move to try to distinguish something as the core of Buddhism and then to call it naturalistic in contrast to other things.
I want to emphasize, I'm not doing that. And there are people who do it. I mean, for example,
but the quotes you just gave me seem to me to say that.
No,
right?
but you inverted the order of the quotes. You inverted the order of the quotes, and is my point. Not intentionally. In fact, what you actually did, I think, is take a quote from the appendix and take a quote from that kind of the note to readers. But my point is, if you read those in sequence, I say, look, I'm just focusing on the naturalistic part of Buddhism. I'm not denying the importance of the other. I'm just not addressing. I'm not getting into rebirth. Okay. Then within the naturalistic tradition, what about the problem that within that tradition, Zen Buddhists may have a different conception of not self or something from these, but what do? I say, well, I'm trying to focus on just a couple of big ideas, or for example, Buddha nature, which isn't, it doesn't, some emphasize not at all, some emphasize, I say, I'm just focusing on the core naturalistic ideas. That's what I meant to say. So, I am absolutely not saying that the core of Buddhism is naturalistic. Now, the core of Western Buddhism is, if you want to, fine. We would kind of agree on that. I assume that these people you're critiquing are putting naturalism front and center. But there are people who say this about Buddhism broadly. I won't get into names. You don't, there are people who I think do this. I don't.
Okay, so let me just make sure I understand the logic here and now before I respond to it. So you're saying there is such a thing as naturalistic Buddhism. That's what I'm concerned with, and I'm concerned with the core of that. Mm-hmm. That's the logic. You go from naturalism to the core of naturalism. Okay, good. So what I would say in response to that is that the fundamental and I don't actually quite put it this way in the book. So in this conversation now, I think is interesting because we're kind of in a way going beyond, what I say in the book and what you say in your book, which is actually makes it more interesting for me anyway. So I would say that the engine of Buddhism, the fundamental engine of Buddhist thinking, is not naturalistic. And by that, I do not mean that it has to do with rebirth or supernaturalism. I think the naturalism-supernaturalism distinction is a bit of a red herring here. I think that the core of Buddhism is the thought that is not, it's not a scientific thought. It's a, let's call it a philosophical or religious or soteriological thought. It's a thought concerned with salvation or liberation. And the core thought is, things are impermanent. Impermanence is suffering. Suffering is non-self. And liberation is the elimination of suffering. So that, I take it to be the core engine of Buddhism. And that I do not think is naturalistic.
Of authentic kind of Asian Buddhism, not just Western Buddhism, right?
I mean, if anything that deserves the name Buddhism, I think that's the fundamental Buddhist insight.
Okay, so can you run by the sequence again?
Yeah. So the core would be that. I mean, if we want to put it a little bit more precisely and philosophically, it would be that all conditioned and compounded things, so all things subject to cause and effect, and that have parts that are that are sort of assemblies of things. All are impermanent, all are suffering, so there's an inherent kind of value judgment, all are suffering, all are non-self, and liberation is the extinguishing of suffering. which entails, the realization of non-self. So that's like the core. Like if you take any of that out, you could say it's Buddhist inspired, it's maybe Buddhist related, but it's not really going to be the fundament of Buddhism. Now, those ideas, I submit, are not naturalistic ideas. Okay. Impermanence is not a naturalistic idea in the sense here that we're talking about impermanence.
Okay.
Causes and conditions are not naturalistic in the sense intended here because they have to do with mental causes evaluated as good or bad. The idea of liberation from suffering, that's not a scientific idea. That's an ethical or soteriological or indeed religious idea.
Well,
so that for me is the core of Buddhism.
Okay. I mean, it's certainly right. This is a core refrain in the Buddhist canon. Everything is impermanent, is dukkha, sometimes translated as suffering. There are others available, but and everything is not self.
Right.
But now, so part of your disagreement is that I think a lot of people would agree with me that you can, at least in principle, interpret these things in a naturalistic way. Permanence, impermanence, suffering. Now, not self gets more complicated. Maybe we'll probably get into this, but because there are various interpretations of it. Some you might say are kind of psychological. Some you might say are more metaphysical. Some you might say are most important in their ethical implication, and so on. There's a lot of ways to look at not self. But I guess I'd like you to say more, and you do kind of, there are parts of your book that I now see related to what you're saying here, but could you say more about why people who think we can assess these ideas, especially the first two, in naturalistic terms are wrong?
Okay, so here's where we connect to Buddhist exceptionalism, and this might not be something you disagree with, but would apply maybe to other thinkers. I think it's possible to render those ideas, that is, to interpret them in a way that makes them, let's say, consistent with naturalism. That's a possible move, and many modern Buddhists want to do that. And I have no real argument with that, except that I think it's possible to do the same kind of thing with ideas in Christianity or ideas in Judaism or ideas in Islam or ideas in Hinduism. In other words, that's just what modern religions do, is they try to, or one sort of strand of what modernity is about with regard to religion is to try to take ideas from religious traditions and render them in a way that makes them consistent with naturalism. That's fine. But the idea that Buddhism is somehow special, different, and better at that, I think is a real confusion, because I think it's not the case. I think that Christians have been trying to do this for centuries. Jews do it. It actually started out, with Hindu teachers doing this before Buddhism came to the West. So there, I think it's the Buddhist exceptionalism that I'm arguing with. Now, you might not be an exceptionalist in that way, and that's fine. But this is a widespread thing.
I mean, here's my view: is that Buddhism is actually quite different from Christianity to the extent that accompanying the evolution of what we might call the conventionally religious part, deities, praying for things, believing in something that's in some sense an afterlife, that and the idea that the way you behave in this life has something to do with whether the afterlife will be a favorable one. Buddhism in Asia has all those things, and they correspond roughly to Christianity. But Buddhism has alongside that a much more well-developed literature that you could call a literature of philosophy and psychology that addresses issues that in the West are addressed in academia, in philosophy departments, and in psychology departments. Now, so I think that is distinctive. Now, of course, Christianity has the theology. Christianity has that too. I mean, take a thinker like the Indian Buddhist philosopher Vasubandhu or Dharmakirti. So these are hugely influential philosophical figures for Tibetan philosophy, Chinese philosophy, Indian philosophy. Very logically precise, meticulous, analytical thinkers. Their analogs are people like Aquinas, Augustine, Avicenna.
that's the right analogy. So if you're going to say, well, Buddhism has this rich intellectual philosophical tradition, of course it does, but so does Christianity, so does Brahminical Hindu thinking, so does Islam, and it's just our culture doesn't find those psychologies, the psychologies embedded in, say, Augustinian or Aquinian thinking, even though they're sort of like deeply in our moral and legal systems, we don't find them as immediately, I will say, seductive in relationship to science in the way that we do with Buddhist models of the mind. But the Buddhist models of the mind are equally religious/philosophical, and the idea that somehow they're more compatible with science is just a confusion. It's not the case. It's just they look exotic to us.
Oh, I think it's the opposite almost. It's not that they're exotic. I mean, I think Aquinas is exotic. And now I'm not that conversant in Aquinas, but what he's best known for is philosophical arguments for supernatural assertions. In other words, like, this is proof of the existence of God or something, right? So the philosophy there may be a whole bunch of Aquinas that gets no airtime, and you're here to tell us about it, but
that's part of Aquinas, and Aquinas also has a very sophisticated kind of psychology of the organization of the mind. But Dharmakirti is the same way. Dharmakirti has a huge section of one of his works is devoted to a proof of former lives and future lives, a proof of karma, a proof of rebirth. And then he has a whole bunch of other things that are really interesting that are more immediately, sort of relatable to philosophical issues that we would try to separate from things we would regard as supernatural. But it's the same in Aquinas. It's the same in it's the same in Descartes, for that matter. I mean, this is just how philosophy evolves in relationship to.
Right. In the case of Descartes, we actually do focus on what would be considered the more secular philosophy. It so happens that Descartes was grounding things ultimately in religious belief, but we do. Anyway, let me just say, here's what I think the position of mine that's most relevant to your critique is that I am a Buddhist exceptionalist in the following sense. Unless there's a part of Aquinas, that I don't know about, and there's a lot I don't know about, and parts of Augustine that I don't know about, that I would just find mind-blowingly good, I am willing to say the following provisionally, assuming it's not the case that there are these mind-blowingly good parts of them that I know about, which is say that, and see, this is where the evolutionary psychology comes into my book. You spend a fair amount of time critiquing evolutionary psychology. You're not a fan. We can get into that, but I don't think anywhere in your book you capture the part of evolutionary psychology, leaving aside whether it's right or wrong, that to me is most important in corroborating Buddhist ideas. And here's what I think is really important. I think that evolutionary psychology tells us, and to some extent modern psychology, but an evolutionarily informed modern psychology tells us, that much more than we realize, our perceptions and thoughts are pervaded by, mediated by, and sometimes prompted by feelings. Okay? That the old-fashioned distinction between affect on the one hand and cognition on the other hand is as wrong as it can be. And that, as Hume suggested, thought, well, I guess he said reason is a slave to passion. But yes, so often the motivating thing for our perception and our thought is our feelings we have that play such a subtle role that we don't appreciate how they are warping our perceptions and our thoughts, and most consequentially warping our perceptions of other people. It's like, I see this when I go through your book. It's like, here's a guy who's criticizing me. And that is shaping how charitable I am or am not being as I go through your book. And so I'll go through and I'll go, this is an egregious distortion of what I said. And then I'll go through a second time and go, well, it could be worse. It's actually not that, and that's because, and this is the way we go through life, even in much subtler things. It isn't just allies on the one hand, rivals on the other hand. In the most subtle way, our perceptions are shaped and pervaded by feeling. Now that's an example of one insight from modern psychology, evolutionary psychology, that I think is, first of all, something Buddhist thinkers really picked up on, A, and B, and this is where the evolution part has to come in. Like, okay, you could have arrived at the conclusions I just stated through just lab psychology without even knowing that humans evolved. But once you know they evolved, and you understand natural selection, you realize that what feelings are judgments. They are codes for judgments that natural selection, quote, wants us to make, right? I mean, natural selection, obviously it's not a conscious thing, but let's personify it just for the sake of shorthand and say that natural selection has an agenda. It has values. It wants us to get genes into the next generation and do things subordinate to that, like eat food, have sex, vanquish rivals, right? That is the value system of natural selection. And so once you understand that, A, feelings in these super subtle ways pervade thought, A, and B, once you understand that they are proxies, the feelings that are shaping our thought are proxies for this value system that I think once you understand it does not deserve our respect, right? It's just this, I don't know, at best arbitrary idea that genetic proliferation, should uber alles, right? Once you realize that feelings are not a good guide to moral conduct intrinsically, then I think you have to have respect for a philosophical tradition, A, that got that early on, and B, developed these techniques, meditation, for kind of separating yourself from these biases ultimately, right? Like becoming more aware of the way these things are coloring your thought. And by the way, this gets into my view of what's important about both about not self and emptiness. So let's leave those aside. But I think those are best viewed in this very context. So yeah, unless there's a part of Aquinas and Augustine that I just don't know about, yeah, the philosophical, psychological part of Buddhism, I suspect, is, by the lights of evolutionary psychology especially, I don't think it's going too far to say, well, I don't want to say superior, because look, all spiritual traditions have their great things, but you can understand that I'm saying there is something special about this philosophical and psychological tradition that looks particularly good in light of what we now understand about the process that created the human brain. Right?
Okay, great. Right. So there's a lot of points there. I'll see if I can remember all of them. So the core point that you're making about how our perceptions and our thoughts are fundamentally biased by feelings, I absolutely agree with. And I think that is something that we're seeing more and more scientific evidence for. So we're coming to understand that from a scientific perspective in better and better ways. And evolutionary psychology is not the framework I think that's best for thinking about that, but that's like maybe a different discussion to have. I think if we want to put it in more general terms, the idea that we are biologically evolved creatures in which how we relate to the world is fundamentally biased by the kinds of feelings and affective states we have, I completely agree with that. I also agree that there are deep insights into that process in Buddhism, in the Buddhist tradition, and I agree that is one of the strengths of the Buddhist tradition. So my criticism of Buddhist exceptionalism is not meant to say that Buddhism isn't a deep and profound tradition that has unique insights. Of course, I think it is, and I think on that terrain it does have some very deep insights. I would say, however, that there are other traditions that also have recognized this point. So I would say that idea is fundamental to Stoicism, that our feelings bias how we relate and perceive things. The Stoics think about it differently from the Buddhists. They're probably ultimately not as analytically sharp about it as the Buddhists, I would say, but they've got that insight.
I don't think they have a technique. Just quickly, I don't think they have a meditative technique that is directly addresses it as Buddhism. But that's just a footnote. Go ahead. There is Stoic meditation, but it's different.
There are Stoic meditations that try to work with that. I would also say that there are strands of Confucianism and Taoism that also are very much shaped by that insight into feeling and affect. So yes, Buddhism though has some really important things to say about that. I completely agree with.
Can I just?
So I don't think we disagree there.
Can I just interject one more thing? And again, another self-indulgent moment. In this note to readers, the final point is, I say, asserting the validity of core Buddhist ideas doesn't necessarily say anything, one way or the other, about other spiritual or philosophical traditions. There will sometimes be logical tensions between a Buddhist idea and an idea in another tradition, but often there won't be. And I quote the Dalai Lama's famous thing, don't use Buddhism to become a better Buddhist. Use what you learn from Buddhism to become better whatever you are. So I'm not trying to be exclusivist. I'm not. Right. In a way, go ahead. I interrupted you, so keep going.
No, that's fine. I think we can establish common ground on that point about feeling and affect. I would say that it is a peculiarly modern and problematic way to think that what meditation is about is an internal individual psychological practice for seeing the link between feelings and biases of craving and biases of kind of cognitive belief states. That's very much a kind of modern individualistic way of thinking about meditation, which isn't to say that you can't do meditation that way, but I would say that meditation in most Buddhist contexts, and even still in modern ones, is very much also about social practices of ritual and community building, and the way you change your perception is through that. It's not through some kind of internal, mental dissecting introspection kind of procedure that we think of as scientific. It's actually a social reshaping project. That's fundamentally what a lot of Buddhism, especially in a monastic context, is traditionally about. So that's just to make sure that we don't render all of Buddhism in terms of a particular modern conception of what meditation is.
Right. At the same time, what I was explicitly talking about in my book is modern Western Buddhism, and I try to be clear about that. And it doesn't. I'm not being dismissive of traditional Buddhism or anything else, but that this kind of meditation, mindfulness especially, in a not necessarily super social context, is a big part of it. But anyway, let's see. So I guess we were talking about why impermanence, suffering, and not self, you think shouldn't be viewed in a naturalistic or exclusively naturalistic way. And I certainly think, not self especially can't be viewed in exclusively. A lot of this, I think one question you could raise about my approach and the approach of other people is just to what extent is it possible in principle to separate the naturalistic part from the, quote, supernatural part? Because they are very tightly intertwined at some places in Buddhism. My view is that you can do it for analytical purposes at relatively little cost. But I acknowledge that that's a challenging thing because, in true kind of Asian Buddhism, of course, these things, like if you want to talk about enlightenment, which I talk about in the book, maybe we could talk about that. In Buddhism, that means you're released from the cycle of rebirth. Well, I would consider that not a naturalistic idea, or at least not an idea. It's not an idea that couldn't be true. It's just that it's an idea that's not amenable to naturalistic analysis, it seems to me.
Mm-hmm. So I think, with regard to all these issues, we probably should say something about what what naturalism means exactly. So I want to make 2 points about that. So one is, this is actually a point that Durkheim makes in his book on religion. He says that the very distinction between natural and supernatural reflects a modern scientific worldview. That is, we make this distinction because we consider some things to fall, within our understanding of the universe as, sort of impersonally law governed according to, rational principles that we can specify and empirically test in science. And then anything that falls outside that, we're going to call supernatural. And then, it's a modern issue how you want to deal with the relationship between the two. Do you want to just dismiss the supernatural outright, or do you want to kind of keep it in its own ancestral sphere? So that's like a modern problem. It's very problematic to take that modern way of thinking and then project it back onto other cultures that don't think in those terms. So for a Buddhist who isn't a modern Buddhist, who is, say, a 6th century Buddhist in India, that distinction doesn't really work because things are causally ordered for a Buddhist, but they're ordered according to the law of karma. So it's both, by our lights, natural in a way and supernatural in another way, but they're not going to chop it up that way. So it just is a reminder that when we're talking about natural versus supernatural, we need to remember this is an issue for us as modern, sort of modern, scientifically informed thinkers. So that's point number one. Now, point number two then is, okay, so what specifically does naturalism mean? Well, I understand naturalism to be a viewpoint that gives final authority to science on how things are. And if then that's our understanding of naturalism, and we take statements like things are impermanent, things are impermanent, things are suffering, impermanent things are non-self, liberation is the realization of non-self, those are now no longer naturalistic statements because they're not subject to scientific evaluation. They're to make an analogy, they're like statements in art or aesthetics. They're in a different conceptual domain. The way you evaluate statements about the beauty of an artwork isn't through scientific procedures. You evaluate them according to other canons. Similarly, a statement like things are impermanent, things are suffering, things are non-self, liberation is the extinguishing of all mental defilements that have to do with attachment to self, that has to be evaluated not according to scientific criteria because they're not scientific statements. It has to be evaluated according to philosophical or religious or ethical criteria. So that, for me, means that naturalism is not the right frame for thinking about those propositions. So my argument, and this might not be true of you, but my argument with a certain type of Buddhist modernist is they present those statements as if they were naturalistic statements, and they're fundamentally not. That's a confusion of like apples and oranges. That's my point.
Okay.
With regard to that issue.
Well, I'm not sure whether I hold the view that you're most strongly in opposition to here. So let me just continue the conversation. I guess I would say it is the case that in the West, we consider something like, say, say, if you overcome this aversive reaction to feelings of anxiety, if you overcome this thirst for the sweetness of a candy bar or whatever, if you overcome these things, you will have more equanimity, be calmer, and suffer less. That's the kind of, I'm not saying that's equivalent to what you just said, but that's the kind of statement that we would say could be evaluated in a therapeutic context. It's a therapeutic assertion, and we consider therapy part of science. Now, I would add that, strictly speaking, nothing about my subjective experience is really amenable to direct scientific observation. And so whenever you're talking about emotions, the subjectively experienced emotions, there's a whole philosophical question about, in what sense that is part of science. That said, these are commonly these are commonly invoked. Feelings are commonly invoked in part of scientific discussions, and we just usually don't delve into the assumptions underlying our inclusion of them in scientific conversations. But anyway, as a starting point, I guess you'd take my point that the idea that parts of the Buddhist prescription for ending suffering or ending dukkha, which is sometimes translated as unsatisfactoriness, whatever, parts of that would fall within the Western therapeutic tradition, right, which we think of as part of the Western scientific tradition?
Well, I'm not so sure. I think that raises a complicated issue, and I expect you're familiar with this, and that is that when we mark things as anxiety and equanimity and positive and negative and therapeutic, we're doing it in relationship to some prior value system about what it is to be a flourishing human being, and there may actually be quite a bit of variation around that, specifically with regard to meditation practice, where, for example, I'm sure the work that Willoughby Britton has been doing on
dark nights,
negative experiences that people report, dark nights and stuff like that, depersonalization occurring through meditation. So if we apply a label like depersonalization to the experience, we're rendering it as a kind of disorder or dysfunction and giving it a clinical frame. But in another context, cultural, historical, that might actually be considered a sign of progress along the path. Now, the issue, is it progress along the path, or is it clinical dysfunction? That's not a scientific issue. That's a cultural, ethical, religious issue. There's no straightforward scientific way to decide that issue, except in relationship to some antecedent value system. And the antecedent value system in Buddhism, in some forms of Buddhism, is, well, those kinds of experiences are good because they're leading you to see the truth of non-self, and that's progress. And in our culture, that's not how we're going to be inclined to look at it. So those are not scientific issues for me. They're not amenable to straightforward scientific measurement, resolution, and testing. They have to do with bigger issues about value and about what it is to be a flourishing human being.
Of course, a lot of what we do about value is accept the person's word for it. Like if they say, I had a terrible time at that meditation retreat, then we call it a dark night of the soul and call it bad and assess what happened. Whereas if they say, hey, I feel great, and now that itself may be culturally conditioned. But anyway.
I think so. Like in some contexts, if you say, I had a great time at that, in that meditation session, in some contexts, your teacher might say something like, yeah, well, keep meditating and it'll go away.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to get, attached to pleasure states. And if you had a really bad time, it might be, yeah, you're actually seeing, things are impermanent, things are suffering. You're seeing there is no self, and, keep working with it. So, these are things that are complicated and aren't sort of straightforwardly scientifically tractable.
Yeah. So let's talk a little about, two things. What you call neural Buddhism. I'm not sure I'm a neural Buddhist either, but maybe you can get me clear on that. And then, the thing that ultimately, in a way, the book is to some extent devoted to advocating, which is the embodied cognitive science, or the embodied view of cognition, or whatever you want to call it. So what is, cause I guess I'm not sure how I see why those two things are as mutually exclusive as you do. But so why don't you tell us what neural Buddhism is and why you think it's the wrong way and embodied cognitive science is the right way.
Right. Okay. So neural Buddhism is, again, this is kind of a term for a constellation of different things that, we'll see people say, but the kinds of things that I have in mind are, Buddhism says there is no self, and neuroscience shows that there is no self, because if you look in the brain, you don't find a self, and so neuroscience supports Buddhism. That would be one example. Or, enlightenment is a identifiable state in the brain, and if we're interested in the neuroscience of meditation, we should try to isolate exactly what that brain state is. That is the state of enlightenment. Or maybe this would be more kind of like a methodological idea that the way to really understand what meditation is and to validate it is by looking at what's going on in the brain when people meditate, or the effects of meditation on the brain. So all of that is what I call neural Buddhism. So I have a bunch of different objections to it, but the principal objection would be that the brain is, of course, a crucially important part of the human organism and the human person, but the idea that you should go looking inside the brain for what meditation fundamentally is or what its value is confused, because meditation is an activity of the whole person in a situated and embodied context, and that's the level at which it needs to be studied. So to give an analogy, just to help people sort of see what I'm talking about.
I want to just focus on, that's the level at which it should be studied. Like any other level, like just doing a brain scan is like not legitimate because it is not a level that encompasses all of this?
No, it's a question of what questions you ask and what methods you use for the questions. So the analogy that I would use is, suppose we take, this is an analogy I use in the book. Suppose we take a gifted performer like Yo-Yo Ma, and we study what is going on in his brain when he plays Bach's Cello Suite No. 1. Of course, it stands to reason, given his years of training and expertise, that the neural systems involved in musical cognition and in motor performance for playing the cello are going to look different for him than they are for somebody who's an amateur player or who doesn't know how to play at all. That is fine. That's information. Mm-hmm. But the idea that would somehow tell us what playing music is, that it would give us an understanding of Bach, that's confused. Because you need to understand Bach and music fully to actually make sense of the neural results. And to understand Bach, you need to know a whole bunch about, history and culture and context and conventions of music. So the analogy with meditation is, of course, it stands to reason if somebody has practiced 40,000 hours of meditation and done 3-year retreats in a Tibetan Buddhist monastic context, their brain is probably going to look different from that of an inexperienced meditator. There may have been antecedent differences in the brain that made them select for that path of life too, for that matter. But the idea that somehow validates what meditation is or gives us a deeper understanding into what meditation is, that's as confused as thinking that you get a deeper understanding of what Bach is by looking at what's going on in Yo-Yo Ma's brain. It's a confusion of levels.
Yeah, well, I certainly think that the idea that it validates meditation is confused. And in general, I share your view. I mean, there's something you say in the book, which totally...
I don't accuse you of this, by the way.
No, I know. But
I don't accuse you of this.
I want to emphasize, this totally captures my reaction when you say, well, of course it changes your brain. Everything you do changes your brain. Right. And that's always been my reaction, which is that, of course, there's going to be a neural correlate. Now, that said, and so I didn't spend that much time in my book on brain science, and I certainly didn't spend any time saying meditation does make some long-term change in your brain that's good, more white tissue, more dark tissue, whatever. I don't do that at all. The one thing I kind of, the main thing I spend a little time on is, psychologists had talked about this thing called the default mode network, very loosely defined network that seems roughly correlated with the mind activity in it seems roughly correlated with mind wandering. So it's kind of interesting that when people meditate, certain kinds of meditation seem to reduce activity in that. That's consistent with the introspective observation that certain kinds of meditation lead to less mind wandering. That's just kind of interesting, although honestly, to some extent, the reason I include stuff like that is because I know there are people who don't take it for granted that everything you do, every mental change changes the brain, and are just kind of intrigued and impressed by that. So, but I totally share your view that there's a little too much gee whiz wow reaction to things having observable brain correlates. I still think it's a valuable part of science. I think, I'll give you an example. You said,
definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, but sometimes you almost give us the impression that you don't. So that is, it's a misunderstanding of you to think that you're saying that brain scans aren't a legitimate part of studying meditation or anything else?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think brain scans are worth doing if the question you're asking is the kind of question for which that is an appropriate method. So actually here I'm just parroting. My wife is a neuroscientist. She does neuroimaging work. So I'm just parroting what she says here. Rebecca Todd is her name. She actually works on what we were talking about before on how affect biases attention. She's got a bunch of papers, studies on that. So she does neuroimaging, and she says a lot of neuroimaging experiments actually don't need to be done. You do a neuroimaging experiment when you have already behavioral data and you have something that the neuroimaging experiment is actually, the appropriate kind of experiment. You have a question for which that's the appropriate kind of experiment or a method to address. So, I have no issue with that at all. Of course, I think that's important. I think a lot of the meditation work, not all of it, but a lot of it doesn't meet that standard. And people generalize off of it in very facile ways. So that's why I sort of go after it a little bit in the book, but I have no objection to it as a method as such. No, of course not.
Okay. Now, another thing you criticize is the idea that enlightenment is a brain state. Now, I would never put it that way, but let me explain why I wouldn't. One reason I wouldn't put it that way, and then let you tell me whether that's the only reason you wouldn't put it that way, or whether there's something deeper or different that is your objection. Okay. I mean, first of all, I'm not, as you know, there's this position in philosophy in the whole context of the mind-body problem called eliminative materialism, which says that consciousness is nothing more than a brain state, right? And to my mind, that's basically a way of saying consciousness doesn't exist, which to my mind is crazy because it's definitely like something to be me. I have subjective experience. So that's one reason I wouldn't say enlightenment is just a brain state. Also, I'm agnostic on whether anyone has ever attained enlightenment. I should say that. I do talk about enlightenment as a kind of idealized state we can at least imagine. But I don't know whether anyone's attained it. I would suspect that if they did, there would be neural correlates. So does my objection to the phrase, enlightenment as a brain state, I don't think that fully captures your objection, right? And I think.
Yeah, right. My objection is a little different. So again, to be clear, this is not something that I criticize you for at all. This is in a different part of the book, and just so our listeners understand this. So I think enlightenment is not a state; it's a concept. What do I mean by that? I mean that the term enlightenment, the term awakening, the term buddhi, if we want to use the Sanskrit, these are words that are understood in many different ways by different thinkers, by different religious teachers in different contexts. And the idea that we could somehow extract out of these really fundamental, disagreements and differences in conception, something that is enlightenment such that we could identify it in the brain seems to me mistaken. So the analogy I use to get at this is love. So, of course, you need a brain to experience love. And it stands to reason that when you experience love, whether it's romantic love or parental love, that, distinctive sorts of things are going to be going on in your brain. But you can't understand what love is by looking at the brain, because love is this multivalent concept that means so many different things. And what it is actually depends on our concept. So, what romantic love depends on how we conceptualize romantic love. What parental love depends on how we conceptualize what it is to be a good parent, and that's socially, culturally variable. So the very phenomenon itself is concept dependent. So and this is kind of a strong argument that I think many people will disagree with. I argue that enlightenment is concept dependent in the way that love is concept dependent. I don't mean that people don't have experiences of awakening or transcendence or transformation, but the very conceptualizing of it as awakening or enlightenment depends on a concept of awakening or enlightenment that has to be embedded in some system, whether it's Theravada or Zen or Hindu or whatever, that gives it meaning, and it is awakening or enlightenment because of that conceptual dependence, just as love is love because of that conceptual dependence. And similarly, in the case of love, some kinds of love are inaccessible to us today. It's impossible for anyone today to access medieval courtly love, European medieval courtly love, because that has to do with a whole array of complex cultural practices and, conceptions of gender and all sorts of things that are just very foreign to us. Similarly, there are certain kinds of awakening practices and experiences, like ones that happened in, say, 4th century BCE India under a culture of asceticism that are inaccessible to most of us today. So that's my point about awakening, is that it's concept dependent and context dependent as well, just as love is.
Okay. A footnote, as I'd say, from an evolutionary point of view, I would think that there was something like of an experience of love before our ancestors had enough linguistic capability to describe it. But that aside, love of offspring, love, but that's just a footnote. We could argue about that. The thing about enlightenment, and this brings us back to something that I think is very impressive, I guess, about Buddhism, is there's this amazing claim that I think is kind of embedded in Buddhism, which is that if we imagine this idealized state of enlightenment, there are different conceptions of enlightenment. You're right to say in the book that, look, it's described this way here, getting rid of the taints. It's described this way here. True, but I hope you'll agree that one reasonably mainstream way to describe at least one of the ingredients of enlightenment, gets back to the role of feelings. And it would involve, no longer having this aversive reaction to the bad feelings and this clinging reaction to the good feelings, and correspondingly the things that induce those feelings, the sight of snakes and food, respectively, whatever. But anyway, the point is, there would be involved this tremendous reduction of the role of feelings in your motivational system as they currently play out. And the claim, this is the amazing part of the claim, that this would at once lead to less dukkha, ultimately the elimination of dukkha, described as very, suffering, unsatisfactoriness, whatever. And also, and here, let me not do the asterisk. Let me just say, and also a clearer view of reality. In some renditions, an ultimately clear view of reality. Now, I think that claim that as you move toward this clearer view of reality, you actually are getting more equanimity, less suffering, less unsatisfactoriness. I think that's a defensible claim, and I think arguing that it's a defensible claim involves science. To my mind, it involves psychology, it involves evolutionary psychology. That's why I bring these things in, but it does get us back to why I think Buddhism is such a distinctively fascinating worldview. These core ideas of Buddhism. So I'm wondering how you would react to that.
So, I would say that what's going on there is that one is singling out a particular way of thinking about a possible way of being, a possible, mental set, if you want to put it that way, that is an elimination of affect biasing, and one is choosing to call that, the supreme, awakening, enlightenment, and then one is trying to either make it consistent with or validate it, depending on how you're thinking about it, through science. And my point in relationship to that would be to say that's got to be seen as distinct from saying what awakening or enlightenment is. It's a singling out of a particular thing and holding it to be valuable, and then trying to establish it through scientific argumentation. It's an open question whether it's scientifically intelligible, because if it means the elimination of all affect biasing, it's an open question whether that's actually something that would be achievable or desirable even.
Well, I agree. I just want to say I agree. I agree.
The desirable question is not I mean, just to be clear, the desirable question is not a scientific question. That's an ethical question, right? Would we want that? If you could have complete elimination of affect biasing, would you want that? I'm not so sure about that, actually. But anyway, sorry, go ahead.
So, well, I agree. I'm agnostic on the question of whether enlightenment is actually attainable. I think movement toward this idealized version of it is. But I want to, as far as you're saying, well, reduction of affect biasing, that's one thing you could single out. Well, I would argue, if you're saying it's one of many ways can be one of many things you can pluck out of Buddhism, I would say comes right out of the first sermon after the Buddha's, enlightenment at Deer Park, right? He says the path to the reduction of suffering involves abandoning tanha, which is thirst, craving, and that's commonly taken to be both in the sense of craving the good feelings and craving to escape from the bad feelings. So I would say, and he says this is the path. It basically says that's the path to enlightenment. So I would say this is really pretty fundamental to Buddhism. And by the way, the second sermon. This is again according to lore, right? It's not like I think we really know much about what the Buddha said, but in any event, as far as how central these things are to the Buddhist canon, the second sermon, and at least certainly in the Theravada tradition, is the sermon on not self, and that is about abandoning the thirst, the clinging again to the various things that we think of as constituting the self. And I think it's very easy to integrate these two ideas, and that's one thing I try to do in the book and explain why it is that abandoning the thirst for certain kinds of affect does involve letting go of this tightly constructed sense of self we normally walk around with. So I would say these things are central to the Buddhist the conception of enlightenment. Granted, there's lots of ways it's described, but this path is fundamental.
Right. So that's one. Let's say central or one core way of rendering what awakening or enlightenment could be in Buddhist terms, which is the elimination of the taints, the extinguishing of all craving, and the disidentification with anything in the body-mind continuum as self. That is of course one conception. There are other conceptions that you see, throughout the ramification of Buddhism. So if one wants to pick that conception and make it central and subscribe to it, that is a move one can make. My point again, though, is that is that's an ethical or soteriological decision or affirmation, and it's not directly validatable or disconfirmable by science. It's in a different sphere of considerations. Now, it may be that you can render that idea in a modern way that makes it consistent with science, so that there's no, consistency is weak, right? It just means it doesn't contradict anything that is asserted in science. That's an effort that you can undertake as a modern Buddhist. And I'm not particularly concerned to argue against that if that's a possible path. It's more to point out the nature of what it is. It's a ethical, soteriological, religious. It's a step or a move in an ethical, soteriological, religious game, if you will, and it's not in itself inherently scientific.
Yeah, it's funny. Soteriological, it refers to salvation,
right?
And it's interesting that you use a term. I would think it's the kind of thing you would object to because, it seems to me a part that belongs to what I've been referring to as the kind of traditionally religious part of Buddhism, because in that context, liberation is release from the cycle of rebirth. If we talk about the end of suffering, I'm not sure I'd call that soteriological. I'm not sure I'd think of salvation, the word salvation, in the same way. But, I mean, that aside, I guess
Well, I mean, traditionally, even if you leave rebirth out of it for the moment, traditionally, the idea would be that that the realization of nirvana in this life, so what would be called nirvana with remainder. In other words, you still have a body, you're still existing in this life, but you have attained or realized nirvana. So the arhat, that is transcendence in this life. It is the extinguishing of all craving and the cessation of all attachment and the realization of non-self. And those realizations are not themselves things that are scientifically provable or disprovable. They're affirmations about a particular way of thinking of human existence, or that's not really scientific.
So this is
not to say that it's anti-scientific. It's just different. It's in a different sphere.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just quickly, I'd say that one of the things I described as being involved in the path in the direction of enlightenment, which is a reduction of the role that feelings play on perception and cognition, I think it is in principle scientifically demonstrable that could lead to clearer perceptions in certain contexts. But that we don't. I'm not saying it's happened.
But hold on a second. Let's think about that. So what does clearer perception mean? It might mean that you're better at detecting something, according to some psychophysical measure. But does it mean sort of seeing things as they are in a way that's best suited to human flourishing? Well, not necessarily.
Let me give you an example.
Right?
Let me give you an example. People tend to overestimate the velocity of approaching objects. Okay? There is such thing as an objective velocity that an approaching object actually has. People, if they're crossing the street or something, they think they need to cross the street sooner than they really need to. If there's like an approach, this is an established thing. It makes sense in evolutionary terms, right? Better safe than sorry, right? Better to get out of the way too soon than too late. I would predict that if you reduced the affective component of the reaction, that is to say the anxiety, the fear, maybe but numbing them with drugs, they would be less inclined to overestimate the velocity, perhaps to their peril. It might not be a good thing, but it's an objective scientific question, right? That's an example.
So, so that's a good example, because here we have, two things we have to consider. One is accuracy according to an objective criterion, and the other would be, let's say, what's adaptive. What's a better practice, either on an evolutionary timescale, or even you might just say in terms of individual behavior. So if we apply that distinction to the idea of eliminating craving, attachment, disidentifying with anything as self, it seems to me an open question, and so here would be a kind of fundamental disagreement with a certain way of thinking about Buddhism. It seems to me an open question whether that actually would be something that would be beneficial. Maybe affirming and inhabiting feelings in a particular way would be how I would rather prefer to live. I'm not defending that necessarily here. I'm just saying that issue. Science isn't going to help me resolve that issue. Science in the sense of objective measurement of what's clearer according to a psychophysical test. That's not going to help me resolve that issue. To resolve that issue, I need to think about, how do I want to be as a human being? What kind of life do I want to live? How do I want to flourish in the world? And science, is relevant, but it's not going to decide the issue for me.
No, I certainly wouldn't think science should compel anyone to adopt any particular lifestyle. I would say that, again, I think evolutionary considerations help. They support one argument in favor of the pragmatic, of the ethical value of not self. I mean, not self means a lot of things, but one thing that some people sometimes report as part of a kind of not self experience is a dissolution of the bounds of the self in a way that makes other living things, other people seem, closer to being as important as you seem to yourself. That's a reported thing. And I think the evolutionary perspective, just helps drive home that the whole system is constructed to deny the idea that other people are as important as you, unless they happen to be like closely related to you or whatever. But it illuminates the kind of ethical perversity of our default mode. Now that assumes that you accept the ethical premise that all beings are, equally worthy of moral consideration, that all sentient beings deserve moral consideration, all people are equally worthy of moral consideration. But if you buy that, and I think most people have at least trouble mounting a strong argument against it, then again, I think the evolutionary perspective, it really drives home that the system we're all living under the influence of, which influences our behavior and our ethical judgments in so many subtle ways, more subtly than we realize, was created by this system, natural selection, that has an agenda that we have no reason to respect. And so that again, I wouldn't say science tells you must pursue the not self experience. I do think this is a case where evolutionary considerations highlight a possible reason to consider some consequences of not self experience to be ethically valid. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't look at evolution in the way that you're describing it, but that's maybe not so immediately relevant to the core point. I mean, I think the core point would be that we want to, given this ethical premise that we're all equally deserving of value and dignity and respect, we want to have individual and social practices that help us really cultivate that and inhabit that. I completely agree with that. I think one way of doing that has been under the idea of non-self. But other ways of doing it have appealed to, we all have immortal souls that are equal before God, or we all are sentient beings who experience pain and suffering. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's different ways of articulating what it is to be deserving of equal respect. The no self is one. But it's, again, to my mind, it's not more sort of fundamentally scientific in the sense of in harmony with evolution, because it's just in a different sort of universe of discourse, conceptually speaking, because no self has to do with disidentifying with body mm-hmm. and mind as self. It's as much a sort of injunction as it is a description.
Yeah, I guess I'm saying that maybe I'm trying to highlight an ethical argument on behalf of the disidentification. But mm-hmm. Now, one thing you say in the book, you do agree with me and with others that there is no self in the sense of a CEO, or at least our conception that there's this conscious me that's running the show is kind of confused. And there, right. You'd presumably agree that psychology can bring something to bear in support of the argument, right? That the psychological science does help support the argument that the CEO. Right.
So if we think that what it is to be a self is to have this kind of internal CEO that is this persisting and unchanging subject of experience and agent of action, then we can use a lot of tools, philosophical, scientific, phenomenological, to get us to see that that's not a particularly good way of thinking about the self. Yeah, okay. That's right. My way of articulating that point is to say that the self is an ongoing construction. So I don't dismiss the self as just an outright illusion. I think that the self is something that's enacted in a kind of ongoing constructive way. It's like a dance. A dance is something that's created by the dance. It's not a sort of independently existing thing apart from the dance. So the self is kind of enacted in a process of selfing, you could say. And, there are many things that enter into that: biological, social, cultural, evolutionary, and so on. So in relationship to Buddhism, there the discussion for me is one where I take issue with people who say, well, Buddhism says there is no self, and science shows that there is no self. And I say, well, that's a kind of tendentious way of saying what science shows. Science shows that a certain kind of self is not something we have good reason to postulate, but science talks about the self not as an illusion, but as a kind of construction, and it's a biological social construction. So it's not as if there is no self. It's rather that we need to understand what the self is as being a construction, and that means it's not an outright illusion in the way that some people are inclined to say. Like Thomas Metzinger, a good friend of mine, he talks about it as an illusion. Miri al-Bahari talks about it as an illusion. I don't. Well, share that way of putting.
I have probably talked about it that way. It wouldn't surprise me. But I mean, I think a lot of people would find it a pretty subtle distinction between construction and illusion. And I think in the case, if you're saying the CEO self actually does not exist, then to the extent that we construct a conception of that, we're constructing an illusion, right? I mean,
well, if the CEO self means there is no sort of internal CEO pearl, then yeah. But if the CEO self means there is a agent that exercises control in a dependent manner, then I would say, well, there is a CEO self. I mean, so it depends kind of, how we specify what we mean.
Okay. I don't know how long you feel like going. I mean, we could talk. You should tell me when you're getting tired.
It's your show, so it's up to you. You call the time.
maybe go a little longer. I mean, you mentioned. I don't know if you mentioned nirvana, but you mentioned when we were talking about enlightenment. Well, let me just say this: there is my description of nirvana, or the kind of dynamics of getting to nirvana. Again, I'm agnostic on whether anybody can get to nirvana, but in principle, the mechanics of getting there. I mean, given that nirvana and awakening are said to be reached at the same time, and in some senses tantamount. It won't surprise people that my conception of getting there involves changing your relationship to your feelings. But anyway, what you say is that's mistaken to see nirvana as a psychological thing, because it really is more about transcendence. Now, I would say it is about a certain kind of transcendence. It's transcending your attachment to feelings, which is not nothing, right? If you've ever tried it. But maybe you mean more than that.
Yeah, so nirvana by definition is the cessation of craving, attachment, the illusory idea of self. And when I say there's different ways of understanding it, and then bring in the notion of transcendence, what I'm talking about there is that, one way of understanding nirvana makes it, sort of definitionally linked to the idea of rebirth, because samsara is the round and round wheel of life, death, rebirth, redeath, and so on, and nirvana is transcendence of that. Then there becomes a question, what exactly does that mean? And that's a different sort of set of issues we could talk about. But that's sort of like one traditional way of understanding what nirvana is. But then I want to also make the point that, nirvana doesn't have to necessarily be definitionally or logically tied to rebirth in that way, because if you render it in terms of the idea of transcendence, then it's transcendence of attachment, craving, mistaken perception and cognition in terms of things as self, and that's logically distinct from the question of rebirth. So then, one way of articulating transcendence would be, as you just did, which is to say that it's some going beyond of our, how do we want to put it, our feeling biased modes of perception and thought, I suppose. And then we would, we'd have to evaluate, one, is that possible? Two, is it desirable? And we're kind of back in the discussion that we were having a little while ago. Okay. But that would be a sort of transcendence version. Yeah.
Okay. There's or
actually, let me add one more other thing. So another thing I say that's maybe not quite so psychological in the sense of like empirical psychology is to say, well, you could render it in a sort of like existentialist way. You could say it's an authentic mode of being that isn't just a matter of sort of traits you can specify in descriptive psychological terms. It has to do with a kind of conversion in your existence in terms of how you relate to the inevitability of your own death and what it is to live in that, full realization in a sort of non-attached way. And that's not necessarily something you can just like operationalize psychologically. That's sort of more a like existentialist rendering. So that could be another way of putting transcendence.
Okay. The one question about you note this is related to nirvana. Nirvana is sometimes described as the unconditioned, which is taken to mean that causality ceases to play a role in effect. You're in some sense in a universe not amenable to causes. And I got into that. First of all, I found the evolutionary perspective kind of interesting because, I see again this kind of severing the link between behavior and feeling as really striking right at the point where natural selection, again, if you want to personify it, is trying to kind of manipulate it. You really, that's where the kind of rubber meets the road. But that aside, you say that there's this irony, and I gather this is apparent, if I read you right, it's a long-standing, it's something that's been considered a paradox before, which I don't really see as a paradox, and it's that, but you take it seriously, apparently other thinkers have, and it's this. It's that, like, well, if nirvana is the realm of the uncaused, then how could meditation or anything else help get you there? Because that would be something causing this state that is uncaused. I mean, the analogy I would make is like, suppose you're in a canoe in choppy waters, and you're like, I'm in motion. I don't want to be in motion. I see this island over there. It is stable. It is solid as a rock. I'm going to use my paddles to create motion that takes me in the direction of the island. Once I'm on the island, I am immune to the motion that I don't like. I will sit still. I will be on this immobile island. I will have used mobility and motion to get me to the place where mobility and motion aren't happening. I don't understand the paradox.
Right. So that's that's one way of dealing with the paradox. That's the raft to the other shore is basically what you've just articulated. Okay. So let's back up. So this goes back to what I was way back earlier in the conversation, what we were talking about when I said there's this kind of like, kind of core thought that is kind of like the engine of Buddhism, and that is that all compounded and conditioned things are impermanent, are suffering, are non-self, and nirvana is peace. That's sort of the core, like the guts of Buddhism as I see it. So nirvana is peace because it's the unconditioned. In other words, it's not conditioned, compounded, because conditioned and compounded is suffering, is not self. Nirvana is not that. It's the unconditioned. So the minute you have a logical kind of structure where you have the conditioned and the unconditioned, then the question arises, what's the relationship between these two radically different things? And the paradox arises, or the conundrum, if we want to put it that way, arises that nirvana is attainable. It's a realization. It's something attainable as witnessed by the reality of the Buddha. Now, not only is it attainable, but a path is specified for its attainment, the Noble Eightfold Path classically. But that is to say then that there is a path to follow, and then something is the result of following the path. But a result is something conditioned. Just conceptually, by definition, a result is something that's conditioned upon, the things that lead to the result. But nirvana is the unconditioned. So how could nirvana be a result? This is the conundrum. Now, different things are said in response to this. One is, look, you're getting hung up on, concepts. Follow the path. It's a raft that will take you to the other shore. When you get to the other shore, you don't need the raft anymore.
Right.
So that's basically what you just articulated.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, more or less. And classically, that involves like faith in the Buddha. Like the Buddha shows you the path, and you follow it, and you'll get to the other side. So this is where I, want to make the point that, like faith is important in Buddhism too. It's not like Buddhism isn't, a religion without faith. Another view is to say, so this is kind of maybe the sort of classic Theravada view, is to say, well, nirvana technically is a cessation. It's an absence. So the way to resolve the conundrum is to realize that you're running on this fuel of craving, attachment, the taints, and when the fuel goes out, there's no more craving, there's no more, attachment, and that just is nirvana. It's the extinguishing of the fuel. Classically, that means there's no more fuel for rebirth, but if we leave rebirth out, it just means nirvana in this life is the fuel is gone, and that is peace. So it's peace because it's defined negatively, really. It's defined as the absence of the taints. And then if you ask, well, is it something positive too? Then that gets tricky, because if you try to make it something positive, then you're back in the language of causes and conditions. So that's another way of trying to deal with the conundrum. Still another way is the way that Nagarjuna and certain, central strands of Mahayana Buddhism deal with it, is to say, well, nirvana and samsara aren't different anyway. There is no difference between nirvana and samsara. There's, Nagarjuna famously says there's no difference between them. There's not the finest, thing to be found between them. So you kind of deconstruct the dualism of the conditioned and the unconditioned. That's another way of dealing with it. So all of this is just to say that that Buddhism has this core driving thought in its engine, and it gives rise to a conundrum, and then different things are said in response to the conundrum that are supposed to help us deal with that. And this is typical of religion, typical of philosophy, that these things happen.
Okay. Let me ask you just quickly back to this embodied cognition thing, which is in a way, again, ultimately it's kind of it's the view you're advocating as, I think in some sense, superior to these other views. Maybe you wouldn't put it that way, but what I want to know is a common reaction that you get to this, the reaction that I personally had, which is like, well, as you describe embodied cognition, who could deny it? It's like, yeah, the body must play some role, and probably subtler roles than I would have appreciated had I not gotten into the literature of embodied cognition. Fine. It must play some role in what the mind is doing. The world out there obviously enters into what the mind is doing, so the most comprehensive view of the mind has to encompass these things. Fine, but I don't see that as in tension with any of the other perspectives, including evolutionary psychology, including brains, including blah, blah, blah. Whereas I think there's even a place where you put it this way. You say, yeah, this is where you say the proper scientific framework for conceptualizing meditation isn't human brain imaging. It's embodied cognitive science. So as I read that, you're saying the proper scientific framework, is embodied cognitive science. Now, I would never say the proper scientific framework is evolutionary psychology or any other thing. I mean, they're all these perspectives can be part of a scientific worldview, right? Are you you've probably heard this before, right? Like, okay, fine, embodied cognition. What does that have to, now let me go in peace and do the kind of science I was doing, right?
Right. Okay. So what I mean by that statement is that there are, so there I'm talking in the context of cognitive science. So I'm talking specifically within the context of the interdisciplinary, scientific effort to understand the mind that includes, neuroscience, psychology, linguistics, computer science, philosophy. That's kind of the framework of discussion. So within that context of cognitive science, in my mind, best, most productive, most fruitful approach for studying meditation is the embodied cognition paradigm. So that is definitely a strong statement that I'm making. Now, when we juxtapose that to neuroimaging, neuroimaging is just a method. So it's not a scientific framework or paradigm. So what I'm saying there is I'm saying the idea that, that you're going to understand meditation in scientific terms properly just through neuroimaging is a mistake, because neuroimaging is a method you use when you have certain questions, and you need the larger theoretical framework to properly formulate those questions, which in my view is the embodied cognition paradigm. So that's like in relation to neuroimaging. Now, in relation to evolutionary psychology is a theoretical framework that I think is fundamentally flawed. And I think it's fundamentally flawed because, for a number of reasons. I think it's based on a number of premises that scientifically don't really work. So one of them is that we know what the cognitive architecture and selective pressures were in the Pleistocene epoch. We know that they are the same ones that we have today. The cognitive architecture is the same that we have today. So you have to establish like vertical descent and homologies, and that we can investigate and understand cognitive function purely in terms of treating the brain as if it were a massively modular system. So I think the evidence from neuroscience doesn't support the idea of brain as being massively modular in the evolutionary psychology sense. I can say more specifically what I mean by that in a moment. And I also think that we don't have the kind of evidence we would need to establish the relationship between the Pleistocene epoch and cognitive function and selective pressures there and our cognitive architecture as contemporary humans. We don't methodologically have access to the kinds of data that we would need to establish the strong claims that evolutionary psychologists make. Now, I want to make clear that my criticisms of evolutionary psychology are entirely within the frame of cognitive science. This is independent of anything having to do with Buddhism. This is, I put on my cognitive science hat. I'm a philosopher who works in cognitive science. That's kind of the way I was principally trained as a philosopher. I put on that hat, and I think evolutionary psychology is a fundamentally flawed research program. So what do I think is the better research program? Embodied cognitive science. So it follows from that, for me, that's the perspective to use if we're going to try to understand meditation. So let me come back to this point about modularity, just so listeners understand what it is I'm talking about here. So evolutionary psychology,
and I should say let me just interject and say I don't accept your description of the modular model as what would be claimed by the evolutionary psychologists who advocate it. But go ahead. I can say more about that. I don't think Lita Cosmides, for example, would recognize your description of it as what she means. But
that's for her to say, but I think I'm pretty faithfully rendering what she says. so evolutionary psychologists say, so they say two things. They say, one, our modern our modern heads house a Stone Age mind. And what they mean by that is that our brain is made up of distinct and discrete cognitive modules that were selected for functions in the context of the Pleistocene epoch,
which is to say a hunter-gatherer, which is to say
right.
most of distinctively human evolution took place in a hunter-gatherer environment, which is, in one sense, hard to argue with. I mean, that's a long sweep of our past.
Yeah, but right. But many people would argue with that. Many people would argue with that. So,
as I put it, I'm not sure, but
so I mean, it has to do with how you think. What you think the relationship between culture and evolution is. So,
okay, but I mean the changes in gene frequencies that undergird the functioning of the brain, it's a very good bet that, if you're talking about the distinctively human parts of the brain, as distinguished from, say, ape ancestors, surely most of that genetic change, which isn't the same as saying the mind isn't malleable or plastic, or that the mind, depending on how you define mind, hasn't changed in a modern environment. But if you're talking about the genetic underpinning of the biological brain, most of that change pretty much must have happened in a hunter-gatherer environment, because that's just the vast majority. Because agriculture wasn't invented until 6,000 years ago or 8,000 years ago.
So that's the anatomy of the human brain. But with regard to function, it's a wholly different question.
You're right.
Because the assessment of function has to do with the effects of culture on development and ontogeny. And so that's where a lot of the issues with evolutionary psychologists lie. So the evolutionary psychology claim is that, with regard to the brain, is that the brain is a massively modular system, where that means that it's comprised of domain-specific systems, that is, systems that are specific for recognizing someone as a mate, or for detecting cheaters in social interactions, or for cognizing motion, perceiving motion in certain ways. That the brain is made up of these discrete modular systems that have minimal interactions with each other, but that function in this dedicated special purpose way. That's the architecture of the human mind. Now, that's a substantive claim that I think is not supported by the best evidence in cognitive science, including neuroscience, which is that the brain is not made up of dedicated special purpose systems in that way, the sort of Swiss Army knife metaphor, or the apps on your phone metaphor. It's rather a densely interconnected system in which function emerges out of dynamical interactions and general purpose capacities for learning and for self-modification under cultural scaffolding. So that's why I think and that's very much sort of the embodied cognition view, which I subscribe to, which is very much opposed to the massively modular evolutionary psychology view. So that's what's going on in that part of the book in terms of my critique of evolutionary psychology.
Okay, let me just read the part of your description that I think Lita would buy into. It says, modules are defined as special purpose, innate programs that operate more or less independently of each other. Each module is thought to be associated with a specific neural structure. Now, if you mean, well, that module is there, that module is there, and that module is there, these spatial, structures, she would not say that. As for, different modules draw on a given module can draw on lots of parts of the brain. A given part of the brain can be drawn on by any number of modules. That's what she would say.
Right. So she's evolved her position from originally asserting.
I don't think she ever said that they were locally specific. I don't think she ever said that.
Well, my reading of their first pass at this in the 90s was much more regional specificity. Now I think she says that modules should be identified as functional entities that can draw on diverse regions of the brain. But still, the issue is that in order for it to be a module in their precise sense, it has to be a functionally specific, dedicated system. And I think that the best models of brain connectivity at functional levels do not support that idea, that there aren't modules in that sense. Yes, there is functional differentiation, but it isn't modular in that precise way. There's rather much more domain general processing and complex changing redistribution of functional profiles across interactions in a way that isn't modular in that sense of module. Mm-hmm. So this is an empirical issue. I could be right, I could be wrong, but that's my reading of the literature and the evidence.
Okay. The other thing I'd quickly say is that when you say they operate more or less independently of each other, that's a view that I think is associated with Jerry Fodor. Last time I talked to Lita, she said she's actually quit using the word module because Jerry Fodor's conception of what a module is, and he isn't even particularly evolutionary in his origin. He's just a cognitive scientist in his orientation. Right. You know, his idea of these walled off modules is so far from hers that she's just quit using the term because people have get mixed up between her view and his. So I think she anyway, this is a technical point. I do quickly on but just a couple of quick. Well, did you want to say something in response to that?
No, I mean, it's of course, you know, open to her to, you know, change and evolve her viewpoint and her terms. So that's fine. I think. So 2 points I would make. So first point is that it seems to me that evolutionary psychology means to be a distinct research program with substantial distinct commitments, as any scientific research program does. And what defines it is a view that cognition is a matter of the functioning of special purpose dedicated mechanisms or systems. And that view is in tension or is opposed to a view that sees cognition as much more a matter of domain general systems and ones that are modified through culture and ontogeny. So that's where the difference lies. Mm-hmm. Now, that's an empirical theoretical issue for scientists and philosophers to work out. How does this have anything to do with Buddhism? There, I would say that the embodied approach, I think, gives us a much more sophisticated way of talking about the role of culture and ontogeny in religion and in contemplative practice. And so that's why I favor it. And that's how it enters into the discussion and why I'm not a Buddhist. That's just for the clarity of listeners.
Yeah, so I mean, again, what you say about culture, where you say that the problem with evolutionary psychology, you know, a better view emphasizes the cultural transmission in human evolution and so on. Everything you say in that paragraph, I'm like, I think an evolutionary psychologist would be fine with that in principle. There may be extensions of it or applications of it you'd make that they wouldn't be fine with. I don't know. But the role of culture is certainly acknowledged. The fact that humans have created culture that has actually changed the dynamics of natural selection itself, such as the invention of tools, no doubt about that. I'd say a couple of quick things in defense of the field. One is, the mind is in many ways malleable. I mean, one thing meditation is about is testing the limits of that and trying to change the way the mind operates in an environment in which certain of its tendencies are just not optimal. And you see if you can, kind of do something about that. As for whether we are or not, saddled with some unfortunate residue of a hunter-gatherer phase of evolution, I mean, certainly we've probably all felt some version of something like road rage, or at least feeling rage in a situation where it's just not doing you any good, could get you killed. It's just a bad idea. There are very plausible stories about how in a hunter-gatherer society, rage is actually an adaptive thing. I won't get into them, but that's an example of how, you can talk all you want about culture, but who among us has not felt counterproductive rage? One thing I like about meditation is that it's an approach to dealing with that. The fact that it's often can be successful is a confirmation of what you're saying. The mind is malleable, but at the same time, I don't think we should minimize the depth of the challenge. A quick thing on modules is the use that I put the idea of the modular mind to is in arguing that it better captures the actual dynamics of mind than the idea of the CEO self, and also helps explain some things we observe in meditation when we start seeming to see the generation of thoughts and so on. I argue that that's actually consistent with a modular view. And let me just give a very commonsensical kind of example of what seems to be conflict between two modules. This is not a very sophisticated view. Doesn't come from Lead or anything, but we've probably all had the experience of being at a cocktail party. You're talking to someone. You want to be polite and keep talking to them. Maybe it's your boss. You want to impress them. Maybe it's who knows. But you see the hors d'oeuvres, and you're kind of hungry. Now, you can actually feel the competition for your motivational system. You feel this urge to go get some food. You feel this urge to not offend this person. And so that almost, you can almost feel two different kind of, quote, parts of the mind competing. And it is a fair surmise that these parts would have evolved at different points. The part of us that is attracted to food, the evolution of that began a long time ago. The part of us that wants to say things that don't alienate certain kinds of people, that presumably evolved more recently than the original kind of hunger drive, right? So that may be a trivial example, but it seems to be one worth, even that experience is caused to take seriously the possibility that rather than thinking of this kind of unified CEO self that takes in the information and then makes a decision and then decides what to do, actually, the motivational system is something that these subsystems compete for. And attention and consciousness are things that these subsystems compete for. And if you kind of step back, you can actually witness the dynamics of that. So now I'll let you reply to that, and then I will say nothing more, I think, in defense of either evolutionary psychology or the modular model.
Yeah, I think that we are complex entities. We have many different impulses. Those impulses compete with each other, conflict with each other, and sometimes we can have access in our kind of monitoring awareness and consciousness to the conflict, and then we can, try to regulate our behavior accordingly, and that's kind of like, an executive function type of thing to try to do. Of course, I personally don't think evolutionary psychology is the right frame for that. I think, I actually think we don't need evolutionary psychology to understand that, even in just sort of everyday folk psychological terms in the way that you just laid out. So sure, we have conflicting impulses. We can be pulled in different directions. We can try to course correct. We can try to inhibit one and, attend. We can do all those things. And the modularity of mind view doesn't really add anything to me in terms of understanding that. It's not really. I don't really see it as actually relevant there, because all of those things are accessible in the way you just described them, actually, to our conscious attention and our working memory and our planning. So they're actually all centrally accessible, and we can, then try to regulate our behavior accordingly. And meditation may help with that. Certain kinds of practices may indeed help with that. Certain kinds of mindfulness practices may indeed, make us better at noticing, impulses more quickly and at, regulating our behavior in relationship to them. I wouldn't deny that.
And may give you a clearer view of the dynamics.
Mm-hmm. The dynamics as they kind of play out in your experience, your sort of the phenomenological dynamics, as it were. Sure.
Right.
Yeah. That's possible.
Okay, so before I ask you to say anything you want to say about the argument you haven't said, my final act of self-indulgence is just to say you kind of criticize my treatment of the concept of emptiness, which is a fundamental concept, as maybe I'm paraphrasing it wrong, as spending too much time on the psychology and not appreciating that ultimately the idea of emptiness is a statement about the physical nature of about the nature of stuff out there, right? That it doesn't that objects don't objects don't have essence, and there's a philosophical justification for that claim by Buddhism that has to do with the degree of interdependence of different objects and interaction among different objects and so on. I just want to emphasize, I'm quite aware of that, and I'm actually making a new argument on behalf of the doctrine of emptiness that is a psychological argument, and it's an argument that if you understand why evolution made us construct essence, impose essence on things, that should undermine your confidence in your intuition that things have essence. And I don't know if I spelled it out clearly enough, so if anybody's curious, I'd say there's a footnote on page 293 of my book that is keyed to page 165. But I just wanted to, it's a part of my argument that I'm actually, kind of happy with, and I think maybe I don't know if I didn't make it clear enough. There's a footnote there trying to spell it out.
I think I understand the point, and I actually like that argument. So let me sort of replay it to you to see if I'm getting the argument right. So one way to put it would be to say that there's a kind of certain cognitive default that we inhabit in terms of how we perceive the world. We perceive, things as having kind of inherent natures, kind of being essentially what they are, as, distinct individuals or discrete substances. And that has to do with how we are, in part, it has to do with how we're biologically configured. And, one of the ways to bring out the idea of emptiness is to show that that things are actually empty of that kind of identity and substantiality, because it's not as if they really are the way that we are perceiving them by cognitive default, that they appear to be that way, but that actually has to do with our kind of configuring them to be that way through our cognitive default. So
right.
Yeah, so I like that argument. I think you can run a kind of let's call it sort of cognitive psychology, evolutionary biology argument for seeing the world that we inhabit as a kind of construction in part out of our way of engaging with it and perceiving it with it, and we treat that as if it's independently real and having an essential substantiality that actually it doesn't have, and that's precisely what the idea of emptiness is trying to articulate and get us to see in Buddhist terms. Yeah, so I like that idea. I mean, I'm totally on board with that.
And again, I'm arguing that the subtle role of essence in shaping perception plays a big role. I mean, the subtle role of feelings plays a big role in the construction of essence, and it really gets us into trouble in our dealings with, like, people we consider adversaries, enemies, nations. In subtle ways, it triggers these cognitive biases that lead to wars and so on. So I think it's really an important thing.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. We have no disagreement there whatsoever.
Okay, good. So we can not conclude on a note of concord, but quasi-conclude, because the final thing I want to ask is just for you to talk about your argument as much as you want in terms of summarizing it or highlighting things you don't think we've touched on.
We've touched on a lot. I mean, we've covered pretty much everything that comes to mind. I mean, I guess one thing I would say is, and it's open to the reader whether they find this persuasive or feel it coming through for them. But I would say that, I wrote the book. I mean, it's called Why I'm Not a Buddhist, but it comes out of a really long time engagement with, Buddhist thought and Buddhist teachers. Oh yeah. And I wrote it in a way that's meant to be kind of friendly criticism. So the idea is, at one point I say in the book, I'm not a Buddhist, but I want to be a good friend to Buddhists. And so for me, the sort of real motivation for the book is to try to get modern Buddhists to get beyond these aspects of Buddhist modernism that I'm finding problematic. So it's not meant to be a rejection of Buddhism. It's meant to be, look, as a good friend, you're saying some things as Buddhist modernists, particularly all around this Buddhist exceptionalism, that I just don't think work, that I don't think are helpful, that I think, embed kind of confused ways of thinking about science and religion and about what Buddhism is. So I want to call you out on those, but I'm doing it because I want Buddhism to get, this sounds presumptuous, but I want Buddhism to get beyond that and to modernize in a way that's beyond those problematic ideas. So that's kind of like the deep motivation for the book, just to be clear about that.
Well, certainly true. I can't imagine a book called Why I'm Not a Buddhist that's actually better informed in terms of Buddhism. You definitely have immersed yourself deeply in Buddhist teachings and also in non-Buddhist Eastern teachings. And I think, one thing I don't get a lot of in the book, but you hear sometimes, I think legitimately, is people from, what you could call Hindu or Vedanta traditions or whatever saying, hey, wait a second, we thought of that. It's like there is, Buddhism is more derivative of that tradition than some people appreciate, I think. After all, according to the history, the Buddha was born into that. But so you bring all that to it, and you're very well qualified to do that. We should maybe quickly mention this idea of cosmopolitanism, just at least mention the word because you can kind of conclude on that. And what you're calling for is a certain kind of cosmopolitan conversation involving Buddhism, which seems fine with me, I think, as I understand it. But
yeah, so the sort of positive message of the book is a defense of cosmopolitanism in the specifically philosophical sense, where it means that human beings all belong to one community and they are all equally deserving of respect and dignity, and that it's important to cultivate, you could say, humility of self in relationship to all other human beings. This is an idea that comes in the Western philosophical narrative out of Stoicism, and then we see in thinkers like Kant and Adam Smith, and then up to modern times with Appia, Kwame Anthony Appia, who's at New York University philosopher who's written very influentially about cosmopolitanism. Also, Martha Nussbaum just has a new book out about cosmopolitanism. And so my argument is that Buddhism has itself historically in India and China contributed to cosmopolitan societies, is doing so now in the modern world. This is, something to support and encourage, and that cosmopolitanism provides a philosophical perspective for seeing the differences between science and religion and working to I suppose, foster more harmonious and informed interactions between them beyond the Buddhist exceptionalist rhetoric. So that's the last chapter of the book, is kind of an affirmation of this cosmopolitan perspective.
Okay, great. So it's called Why I'm Not a Buddhist, with, I guess, conscious reference to Bertrand Russell's Why I'm Not a Christian.
Right. Right.
And I guess, I imagine Russell, of course, one difference is Russell was in a culture that was just full of Christians, and I kind of imagine him just getting slowly more and more fed up with things they were saying and finally having to write about it. You aren't in that. Canada, where you are, is not full of Buddhists, but at the same time, has there been a little of this, like, over the years, more and more things said by different people, part of modern Buddhism, that you just felt you had to rebut?
Yeah.
And finally, here we are.
Kind of. It was a combination of working things out for myself, my own ambivalences, my own kind of conflicted allegiances, and writing is one way that I do that. But also a feeling that I was becoming increasingly unhappy with a certain way that the Buddhism science dialogue was going, and I wanted to call attention to that. So it is different from, I am, of course, alluding to Russell because I'm a philosopher and, I have great respect for Russell as a philosopher, but it is different in that he really wanted to attack Christianity, and Christianity, of course, had pernicious social power in the England of his time, and that's not our situation with Buddhism, and I'm not concerned to attack Buddhism in the way that he wanted to attack Christianity, or indeed he wanted to attack religion in general, and that's not what I'm doing. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, great. Well, thanks. So people, you're on Twitter, right? People can find you. What is
That's
your
right.
Twitter handle?
It's Evan T. Thompson.
Evan, what's the middle letter?
Evan T. for Timothy, Evan T. Thompson.
Okay. And I'm at Robert Writer, Wrighter. Book is Why I'm Not a Buddhist. I also encourage people to look at your Waking Dreaming Being, and obviously the embodied mind, which you co-authored, is relevant to this whole discussion. So, congratulations on the book, and I almost worry that we talked. I mean, first of all, we pretty much set a record for length here, and I worry that we've talked about so much that there isn't a good excuse to talk again, which would be too bad because I'd like to do it before terribly long.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Okay,
I'd be happy to talk again.
Well, let me go through my markup of your book and see if there are grievances of mine that I have failed to air.
Okay, good.
And that'll be next time. Okay, thanks, Evan.
All right, thank you very much.